So you already know that a function is a chunk of code that returns a result. It also has the possibility of accepting arguments. Functions are an ideal way to extract repeated pieces of code into a single reusable pattern. Functions make reusable logic more useful and your working SASS file more readable. If there isn't a built-in function that accomplishes what you need to do, then you can create a custom function. Now you might be thinking, don't Mixins do that? Well, the main difference between Mixins and functions is that functions return values. Mixins, on the other hand, return blocks of CSS code. Functions and Mixins are very similar in nature, and because they can both accept variables, you might end up creating a Mixin when what you really need is a function. The output from a function can be any type of SASS data, including numbers, strings, colors, booleans, or lists. Mixins will make your life easier by lessening you having to type repetitive code, but a function is going to allow you to strip repeatable logic from your code. Functions are written in SASS as an @function directive, followed by the function name and arguments. Since functions work with the value of style attributes, they're great for calculating values that you may need to reuse elsewhere. As we've already looked at, SASS has many built-in functions that you can use, but sometimes you may prefer or need to use other functions. You can create them yourself. To create a custom function, you need two SASS directives, the @function and the @return. You'll go ahead and write @function and then put the function name and possibly pass on some arguments. Then you'll use the @return directive, and that's going to contain the value that you want to have returned. Note that the arguments that are passed on to the function are optional, though more often than not you will have arguments. Typically, a SASS function is going to run some calculations using the arguments that have been passed to it and possibly some global variables. And of course, because they're global, all the functions can access them. Let's look at how we can create a custom function in our project. Here we're going to use a file that we were using in a previous example, our ocean page. Remember that this is a pretty basic page, and in this particular example, just to keep things more concise, I've put all of the SASS and therefore all of the CSS in one file, rather than breaking it up into partials. You may have recalled that we were using the built-in percentage function that allows us to perform a sort of calculation. I'm using that twice inside of my web page, and this is something that I may be using repetitively multiple times. This is using the calculation of target divided by context equals result. By using this, we can achieve a fluid layout based on a reference design that was made in pixels. Instead of using the built-in functions, we're going to go ahead and create our own custom function. The only rule that you have when creating a function is that you need to identify the function prior to using it. So I'll go ahead and I'll put my function up here near the top of my page. I'm going to put it right underneath my variable for ocean, and I'll just make a comment that says custom function. I'm going to use the @function directive to specify that I'm creating a function. I'm going to give the function a name, and in this case, we're going to call it calc-%. In the parentheses, I'm going to pass on two arguments, the target, and then I'll put a comma, and then I'll put another argument for the container. Next, we're going to use the @return directive, and then we're going to write inside of parentheses that the information that we want to return is going to be target divided by container. This is the mathematical calculation that we want to perform. Because these are prefaced by $signs, we know that they're going to be variables, and we're identifying them right here in the function. Then I'm going to multiply the results of this by 100%. Now that I have the function identified, I'm going to go back down to these declarations that we already specified for width. I'll replace this line of code with the name of my function. In this case, that's calc%. And then I'm going to open the parentheses and I'll pass on the values. They are 620 pixels and 904. What's going to happen is this information is going to be calculated. I'll go ahead and save the page. And if we look at our page in the browser, nothing has changed. We wouldn't expect anything to change here. Next, we'll do the same thing for the aside. Again, I'm just going to specify the name of my custom function, and then I'll pass on the values. So I'm going to get rid of the mathematical equation that's in the parentheses. I'll replace this with the values for those two arguments. So we'll use 284 pixels, and then we'll pass on comma and do our 904 pixels. I'm still going to have the -3% so that this gets calculated correctly. If we save now and we look in the browser, nothing has changed. And just to prove to you that this is working, if I go back into brackets and I change one of these numbers, so if I make this 600 pixels, when we go back into the browser and refresh, you can now see that the layout has changed. So we don't want our layout to look like this. I'll change these numbers back to 284. We'll make a save and we'll refresh in the browser. And now you can see that it reverts to how it was before. Creating custom functions is really helpful and useful, and I'm sure you'll find lots of different ways in which you can incorporate them into your projects. By creating the custom functions, you can create useful snippets of code that you want to reuse, but still be able to modify and give you a result. You're having SASS do the heavy lifting for you. By incorporating functions into your projects, you can write lighter and cleaner SASS that's more readable.